Hello. In today's mini lecture, I would like to describe the origin of a term that we've been using in the course so far, the term the Middle Ages, and use that as an introduction to the next unit of study, which we'll turn to soon, which is called the Renaissance. I want to begin by reminding us that these labels that we affix to certain chronological periods of time, we talk about the Middle Ages or the Renaissance. Later, we'll turn to the Reformation. We talk about the Enlightenment or the era of the French Revolution. All of these labels, in reality, are fictions. They are creations by historians that we impose on the past to give it a certain order, to make sense of the past. But it's not as if these terms or labels are inherent in the period itself. It's not as if somebody in 1420 opened a newspaper and read a headline that said, "The Renaissance begins today." These are always labels imposed by historians after the fact, trying to describe new ways of understanding what it meant to be human, new understandings of philosophy, of transcendence, new understandings of authority, really, that have a certain new coherence to them. But again, they are useful fictions, and sometimes they hide as much as they reveal. So when it comes to this term, the Middle Ages, which we use so often we don't even think about it, what is it that we mean, especially by the term middle? What's middle about the Middle Ages? Well, as it turns out, this phrase was an invention by a small group of intellectuals in the 15th century who began to dig around in the archives of monasteries, who began to read their history more carefully and more deeply. And they discovered, when they encountered the literature, the writings, and then later the architecture of the ancient cultures of Greece and Rome, they discovered there models of clarity and precision and insight into the human condition that they felt had been lost or had been forgotten. Now, it's important to recognize that after the time of Christ, the basic way of dividing history was clear. That is, human history, according to Christian thought, could be divided into two very clear eras. That was the time of human history before the revelation of Jesus Christ, before the incarnation of God in the person of Jesus, and the period of history afterwards. With the birth of Jesus, we say the reset button on time itself was pushed. Time began anew, in a sense, and so we even today are very used to this division of history into BC, the era before Christ, and AD, Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord, the period after the birth of Christ. Even completely secular people think about, oh, this is the year 2012, 2012 years after the birth of Christ. That's a division of history that says the coming of Christ was so decisive, so crucial in human history that time itself began anew. That's a standard Christian way of dividing history. But what was new in the Renaissance, and this is going to be an important point, what was new in the Renaissance is that this group of scholars, they began calling themselves humanists, we'll get to that term later, looked back to the classical culture of Greece and Rome, and they recognized there that people in that era were writing with a clarity and a precision in the use of Latin, for example, that had completely fallen away during their time. You might think of it in English. We sometimes, when we're texting on the cell phone or something, we use abbreviations that when they're written out are embarrassingly simple. Or we say things like, what you doing? We use that phrase, what you doing? But if you would spell that out, WATCHYAUDOIN, it would look, wrong in printed language. The Latin that people in the 11th, 12th, 13th century had begun to write was as if you were transcribing oral speech into written form. And they dropped off endings, they used shortcuts. It was not a precise language at all. It was filled with ya knows and y'all, turns of speech that are colloquial, but not academic, not precise. And the humanists in the 14th and 15th century, when they began to recover the texts from the Romans and the Greeks, and they saw those people knew how to write. They wrote clearly, they wrote elegantly, they wrote precisely. And they began to read the writings of Cicero and Tacitus and Virgil. And then they pushed back behind them and they began to discover anew the philosophical writings of Plato and Aristotle. They read the plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and they recognized there that in this classical era of the Greeks and the Romans, people were thinking deeply and profoundly about what it meant to be a human being. What's the nature of our humanity? They were thinking about questions of justice. What's the source of justice? How do we know what justice is? They were thinking about law, about the importance of legal precedent, and about legal codes, how to write law clearly, simply, elegantly. They cared a lot about government, about civil order, and they wrote texts that we would call political science texts. And then these same 14th, 15th century humanists turned to the area of art, and they saw in the Greeks and the Romans an appreciation for beauty and a sense of proportion. They uncovered the sculptures of the early Greeks, and they saw the enormous civic architecture of the Romans, and they looked at their own age and they were embarrassed. They said, we've lost all of this. And they began to describe the era or the period of time from the fall of Rome, so maybe about the 4th century AD, to their own day as a kind of vast wasteland. They called it the Middle Ages because they looked to their own period, their own generation, as an age of rebirth. That's what the word Renaissance means. It comes from the French Renaissance, rebirth. And they said, we are living in an era in which the classical culture of Greece and Rome is being reborn. We are giving new birth to this attentiveness to language, to art, to literature, to philosophy. And we are part of this rebirth. And they wanted to distinguish themselves from the era in between classical culture and their Renaissance, and that term comes, and that they described as the Middle Ages, the period that comes in between. It's a kind of long waiting room where nothing of cultural importance or significance happens. Now, this is a fairly arrogant description of the previous era, but it marks a new awareness of the possibility that classical culture can be recovered. And it also marks, and here is a really important point I want to emphasize, it also marks a new view of human history that is now being categorized in secular language. This is a view of history in which it's no longer the birth of Christ that is the most important division. They continue to use the convention of the Christian calendar. But now they say what matters most is the culture of Greece and Rome, classical culture, forgotten during the Middle Ages, that we are recovering. And that classical culture is pagan. That classical culture did not know Christ. In fact, the Romans were enemies of Christians. And yet these emerging group of scholars in the Renaissance says, it doesn't matter. They still wrote great poetry. They wrote great literature. They understood how to think clearly and precisely. and those are the models that we want to emulate, that we want to follow. Marks the era, the beginning of a new way of thinking that is secular, not intentionally, not dogmatically, but implicitly it's secular, and it's focused on the human being. That's why we call it humanism. It's focused on the human being and its possibilities for doing great things in the fields of literature, of art, and later of science and philosophy. So that's why we call it the Middle Ages. But remember, when we use that term, we are accepting the Renaissance snobbishness about the era that came before. We'll say more about the Renaissance in the unit that follows.